Welcome to Parshat Vayikra, the first Parsha in the Sefer of Vayikra. So we have moved from Sefer Shmot to Sefer Vayikra. And I wanted to talk today about smells. For those of you, I think some of you were at the Havdalah service outside last year in the Sabbath's backyard, where I talked about how I have this like weird obsession with smells. And it's still true today. I think that smell is such an interesting sense. It's one of my favorites. And it is referenced today in a way that I think shows perhaps it is one of God's favorites as well, if I may be so bold as to guess one of God's favorite scents. So I'm going to share my screen here. And here you can see that I marked here that it's in Vayikra in our Parsha in chapter 1, verse 9 and verse 13. In fact, this exact phrase is there, Ola ishe reach nichoach ladonai, an offering by fire of pleasing odor to God. But it is repeated, the phrase reach nichoach, a pleasing odor, is repeated 17 times in the whole book of Vayikra. So God clearly enjoys smells, or we offer pleasing smells that are pleasing to God often. And Moses Mendelssohn, who is a German Jewish scholar and theologian, he published a translation and commentary on the Torah in German. It's called the Biur. It's very hard to find online. So we're going to have to take the word of Rabbi David Kasher that this is what he says. I linked here where Rabbi Kasher's blog post is. I often use him as a resource, and here he has some of the ideas I lay out here are also his ideas, and he brings this quote. And this quote is so good that I've decided to bring it, even though I don't have an exact Hebrew quotation. I always like to be able to find something in the book. But in his biur on this parsha, he talked about how the sense of smell in the Holy Hebrew language corresponds to the power of memory in the soul. For the idea of memory is the remaining impression in the soul after the tangible experience has passed. And I think that that is what I love so much about memory. He really nailed it for me, which is that when I walk outside on my porch in the springtime, like yesterday when it was like a little sunnier and warmer, I feel like transported to softball practice. Like it smells like baseball to me. That's just the sensation I have, right? Or I love hiking as it starts to get cooler in the fall, because I feel like when you smell the pine needles on the ground, like as you step on them, that it smells like Sukkot, right? My aunt and uncle hung pine branches in their sukkah, and so that smell is just so strongly associated, right? It's an impression in my soul after the tangible experience of that has passed on. And I'm curious if other people have smells. Sometimes I just listed, I think, 2 good smells, although certainly feel free to disagree. But sometimes there are like, I don't want to say bad smells, but maybe like smells that are not usually our favorites that have a sort of similar feel to them. So the 2 examples that I've thought of are like the mustiness of a garage, right? My mom said, oh, I loved the garage when I was a kid. It was like filled with hidden treasures, right? So that's not like generally a good smell, but it's a smell that has a fond association. Or I was talking to a friend yesterday and she said, oh, I love the smell of gasoline because when I was a kid, we took road trips. And so that's like the smell of adventure in my house. I see Elizabeth nodding. Maybe she likes that smell too.
I don't think I like the straight smell, but to me, like the smell of a hardware store is very distinctive and tinged with gasoline. And yeah, that's sort of a funny, similar smell. Yeah.
Interesting. Any other good smells? What does the hardware store remind you of?
I don't know. I think I just often went there on trips with my father, and it's just very like, I walk into a hardware store and I'm like, this is a hardware store.
Nice. I love
Yeah.
that. Yeah, there is like a mix of distinct smells in a hardware store, I think, right? Like paint and sort of like that rubbery smell.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love smells. I'm with you.
I feel like also sometimes people, like my grandmother had a very distinctive smell because she used
Mm.
the same soap and the same perfume my entire life. And that's like kind of a
Mhm.
similar, very strong association. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Even if you would never choose to like go out and make that perfume your
Mhm.
sort of signature scent, it still has such a fond memory associated with it. I love that. Anyone else want to share a fun smell? All right, everyone should feel free to add them when they think of them. And so what Moses Mendelssohn is saying is, right, all of those feelings, like even just watching Elizabeth talk about the smells, right, like everyone smiles when they talk about the smells that they love. These are the reasons. That is the reason that it says, according to Moses Mendelssohn, a pleasant scent. That is one which will provoke the desired memory before God. And so you could almost imagine that we're trying to play some kind of, I don't want to say trick because it's not sneaky, but to nudge God along on the path to remembering something, right? So, if it was my friend who liked to go on road trips, maybe if her father was, sick with dementia and was feeling sad, they might sort of give him a whiff of the gasoline, like, oh, remember those road trips? It would like jog his memory to that place, right? Or on a day where you're missing your grandmother, Elizabeth, you might like smell an old sweater that you had inherited of hers, or whatever the thing is, right? And so the question that I had, and Rabbi Kasher had, was, what memory are we trying to provoke when we offer korbanot? And so one option is all the way back from Sefer Breshit. So the only time, right, it's mentioned however many times I said, 17 times in Sefer Vayikra, but in Sefer Breshit, there's only one time where that combination reach nichoach is mentioned. And it is in the story of Noah. So after Noah, the floodwaters recede and he leaves the ark, and he makes a sacrifice to thank God for being rescued, being saved. And it says, Hashem et that God smells this pleasing odor. Vayomer Hashem el libo, lo osif lekalel od et adama. God resolves to never again doom the earth because of mankind, ba'avur ha'adam, ki yetzer Lev ha'adam raminu arav, because the devisings of the human mind are evil from youth. Like basically, they can't help themselves, right? V'lo osif od lahakot et kol chai ka'asher asiti, and I will never again destroy every living being as I have done. And so perhaps I think what we are trying to remind God of is not of his capability to make the flood, right? But of this sort of pleasant moment at the end of the flood when God resolves never to do it again. And so I think you could imagine that if you're bringing a chatat offering, right? You've done something wrong and you're bringing an offering to apologize before God, that this is very compelling, right? You're saying, God, remember this good smell of sacrifices? Like, can you forgive me the way you forgave mankind at the end of Parshat Noah? And that is a beautiful message in and of itself. But while I was reading this beautiful Parsha blog, I remembered another place where we say there were good smells, and I was very compelled to bring that as well. So a sort of relative, more recent memory of a few weeks or months or years back at Matan Torah. So when the Jews received the Torah at Har Sinai, we know that there was a lot of loud noise and smoke, and you could imagine that it might smell kind of like hectic, maybe is the right word, right? Like that it would smell like a bonfire. It's sort of like a sort of strong and maybe like dominant smells is sort of how I thought about it. And also the smell of fear, right? Like we say that the people were scared. And so I think there are some smells sort of associated with that emotion. But interestingly, the rabbis in Masechet Shvat have a totally different conception of what it might have smelled like. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi is interpreting a pasuk from Shir HaShirim, where it says "Lechayav ka'arugat habosem," that God's cheeks are as a bed of spices. And he says, what does that mean to say God's cheeks are a bed of spices, or some kind of like storage space for spices? He says, Kol dibur v'dibur sheyatza mipiv hakadosh baruch hu, that every single word, or perhaps you're okay, of the 10 Commandments that were, oh God. Sorry, this is all recorded. No, I'm spilled yogurt all over the floor, and now it's all over my lap. You can. You're okay. I'm not bad. that so either every word that came from his mouth, or maybe every commandment that was given of the 10 Commandments, nitmale kol ha'ulam kulo b'samim, that the whole world was filled with spices and fragrance. And then the text goes on to say that then God would sort of blow a cleansing breath through the world, so that there would be a fresh start for the next one of the Aseret HaDibrot, and there would be a new smell. So you could either imagine like 10 different signature smells per commandment, or like maybe just that the world was filled and then retracted and then filled again with beautiful smells of bisamim, of spices. And so I thought that was such a lovely metaphor or understanding of what was happening at Har Sinai, because amidst all of the loud noise and the lightning and the thunder and the smoke, there was also just this very pleasing smell. And I kind of imagined it the way, Elizabeth, you were talking about your grandmother, right? That like there was some kind of, now there'll be an association every time Bnei Israel like sort of catches a whiff of bisamim, they'll think of Matan Torah, because bisamim are like mint that grow in your garden or cinnamon that you put in your food, right, to help it stay for longer. And so they use these smells all the time. You're okay. And so there's something sort of beautiful about that. And when do we use bisamim? And this is what I talked about at Havdalah, right, in the Sabbath's backyard, is that we use bisamim when every week when we let out Shabbat. And so bisamim could be, when we smell the bisamim, right, it could be sort of remembering the good smells of the week that has passed. It could be like sort of smelling that extra spirituality of Shabbat, right? We say we have an extra soul or an extra neshama on Shabbat. It could be an anticipatory smell of the week to come, right? Sort of praying for good smells. But I think that when we think about it in the context of this week's Parsha, it's like a holy smell, or not a holy smell, but a smell. To smell is to be holy, right? It's like to be in our Tselem Elohim of walking in God's ways, because God clearly smells a lot in this week's parsha, and also in all of Sefer Vayikra, but also God likes the smells of Noach, and God creates a smell associated with Matan Torah. So that is sort of where maybe like the parsha is left off. But then I found this beautiful Sfat Emet. The Sfat Emet is a Hasidic commentator, and he wrote this beautiful idea here, and I think it shows how strong, another maybe sort of added benefit of smells. Right, he quotes our Gemara in Masechet Shabbat here, and then he says, what does that mean? Why would Rabbi Hoshua ben Levi want smells? Maybe it's Moses Mendelssohn's idea, right? That's sort of where I was going with it. That smell is just a really important and fundamental part of our missensory toolkit. But the Sfat Emet has another idea, and he says that it means that those who are unable, people who couldn't receive the core of Torah, maybe it was too mentally challenging or spiritually challenging. It's sort of hard to know exactly what the Sfat Emet meant, but even those people who couldn't really chop it, is how you would say it, right? Like in yeshiva, who couldn't really catch it. Reach Tov Kalet, that they would receive or absorb its good fragrance. And he quotes a halacha here, which is interesting, that when one enters a spice store and smells many spices, that they should say the bracha on spices. And I think what he's saying is that smell is sort of equal opportunity. If you have the technical skill to make a really good cake and then you eat that cake, no one else got to taste the cake, right? But if you have the technical skill to make a really good cake and someone walks into your house, you can enjoy the smell at the same time as someone else, right? It's like it's for everybody. It's sort of available. It also, I like that idea that it really like it envelops you. It's, this morning I went shopping with Vayikra at Trader Joe's, and she was like pinching her nose because it smelled like a cleaning supplies in one aisle. And I said, it's not so strong anymore. You can like let go. And she said, no, like I need to stop the smell. Right. And that's, you have to like take a physical action to stop smelling something. Whereas to not taste something, you just don't eat it, right? Like, why didn't it say that God saw the sacrifices or tasted? Would have been a super interesting anthropomorphism, right? I think that smell is part of it, is like when it's put before you, God, like, please allow it in, allow it to absorb into you. You don't have to take any action to do that. Like, it's all there before you. In fact, you would have to physically stop the smell from entering your nose. But also this idea that when God came down, right? Kablu kulam reach Torah, that everyone receives the fragrance of Torah. When it wafts over the community, it wafts over everybody. And so there's this beautiful message of inclusion here. And I think that what I like better than the Noach read about this sort of Kabbalat Torah read is that the Noach read makes sense when you've done something wrong. But what about when you're just offering a korban olah, like an offering, a sort of general offering, or a korban tamid, one of the ones that was offered every day, or a korban todah, right, a Thanksgiving offering? I think that this fits that model better. And here, what we're saying is, God, remember how good you made it smell for us. We want to give that back. Right? When we talk about what korban means, when we call it sacrifice in English, many of the commentators, Rabbi Hirsch among them, was very upset because he felt like actually korban comes from the root karev, that we are to be closer to God. And so here I think we're saying, remember that time we were really close? Like, almost if you're fighting with a spouse and you say, oh, remember how happy we were at the chuppah, right? And then you smile and you can sort of move on past that. Is sort of what we're saying to God. Like, oh, remember that beautiful moment when we were so close? Let's get there again. And so I want to end, oh, here it is, with a little piece from Masechet Brachot. Rav Zutra, interestingly, he asks, why do we have to say a bracha over a scent, right? If we say brachot over food, right, nehanin is generally over food because it improves our body, right? I think at a time of food scarcity, there was like much more, I know you're sad, much more intention behind, behind it. He says, why now do we say a bracha over scent? It doesn't seem to help us. And he says it comes from the pasuk kol haneshama tehalel ya, that in Tehillim it says every soul should praise God. And he explains, right? What is something where just the soul could praise God? You would think it would say every person should praise God, and then like body and soul are sort of under that umbrella. And so he says, why does it specifically say soul? It must be something the body actually doesn't derive benefit from. And he says, what would that be? Heve Omer, you might say, zehareach, that this is the scent. And so I think that underscores that point of like seeking that divine closeness and holiness is like our body. I mean, I think our bodies do gain greatly from scent because I enjoy the scents, but you might be able to say that's my soul enjoying the scent, right? And that somehow this is like otherworldly. Scent is otherworldly. And so when we offer pleasing scents to God, we're saying, listen, we're trying to walk in your ways. We're trying to emulate this. We're trying to provoke memory of good and happy times, whether there are times where you forgave us or there are times where we just felt an extraordinary closeness, that's the point of the sacrifices. And so any other sense would not go as far as that of scent. So I wish everyone a very sweet smelling rest of their week and a sweet smelling Shabbat. And I would love to hear other smells or thoughts, ideas on these sources.
I have something to say.
Yeah, please.
When someone is not feeling well or about to pass out, you give them smelling salts. So you bring them back.
I like that. So it's this your sense of smell that somehow works to revive your whole body. That's beautiful, Florence.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah.
I have a thought. Quite often, I think it says that God finds the korban a pleasing smell, is it? Or what is it?
A reach nichach, a pleasing smell.
And it seems very anthropomorphic. I just don't understand that.
Like why we choose to anthropomorphize God at all? Or why we choose
I mean, the issue of God having a savoring that pleasing smell. It's
Mm-hmm.
just bothers me.
Right. What does it mean for God to smell something? God doesn't have a nose. Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. It's not certainly these anthropomorphic things are not for everyone, right? We're coming up on Pesach and there'll be the finger of God and the arm of God. I think that I would imagine a lot of it comes from our inability to understand God without somehow attaching our own experience, mapping our own experience onto God's experience, right? Because it's so unknowable at all. And so somehow saying, oh, maybe God smells good smells is our way of identifying with God. And I wonder if that's right. It would be hard to say, oh God, let me associate a memory for you, right? What does that mean? But to say, oh, God smells and that brings an associated memory, that's like a little bit different, maybe. I don't know.
Can I have a very practical comment?
Yeah.
So if you think about it, I think that so smell is that literally that part of that element's molecule comes to your nose.
Mm-hmm.
So when you smell something, then it's almost the same as tasting it. Because so the molecule enters your body from that. Otherwise you wouldn't smell it. And so what I was reading about once that it's a math problem that you can calculate that was the chance that during your lifetime you inhale the same molecule as like Leonardo da Vinci or anyone in history. And the funny thing is that it's actually more likely that you share at least one molecule with someone historical or recent than not. So wow. We are all, yeah. So for me, this, the breath of God, it sort of feels like that in two ways, that it's sort of everyone is breathing it in, you want it or not, even if you weren't there physically, the breath is lingering around and you still breathe it in more likely than not, even if you anthropomorphize it. So if you think about, so even for a person like Moshe, not to mention a non-person entity. And the other thing is that it becomes part of your body. So you smell it, so that ingredient is in your body after that. So that's what I'm thinking, that like sharing the.
I love that. I love that it connects us to like a strand of history, right? That when we smell something, it like actually is the same smell that someone smelled, hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Yes.
That's a really cool thing, because we know, like, as landscapes are radically changing in our lifetime with global warming, right? That we can't see the same things perhaps that our ancestors saw. But to be able to say like, oh, I smelled that same thing, that's really cool. I like that a lot. And I love that you referenced that pasuk, right? Yudit was talking about how in the creation story, it says that God blew life into man's nose, right? So like scent plays a very important role very early on. That's a great reference. Beautiful.
Yeah, so I think in a metaphorical sense, it's how to say it, like in a metaphorical sense, I think it's even like physically true, like how I don't know, but you see what I mean, so statistically speaking, it's just true. It's not even a question.
I love that. Beautiful.
I killed the conversation.
No, not at all. I don't think you did. I love, this is something I found specifically about Ann Arbor, although I'm sure it's true of other university towns. I love the science that like trickles its way into Torah conversations, because for me, it's like very affirming, right? Because I feel like when I walk down the street and I smell a good smell, like, oh, I feel like this really like brought me up. It maybe like felt spiritual to me in some way, right? Like when I stand on like the top of a mountaintop, I like to smell like the air, right? Like I'm always telling my kids, oh, take a deep breath. Doesn't it smell great like on this part of the trail or whatever? And I want to say, like, if it smells divine, it feels like a divine connection for me. And so to say that like that is the air that God blew into our nostrils, that's beautiful. That I love it. It's science and spiritual all at the same time.
Yes, exactly. It's adding to each other, not exclusive.
Yeah, totally. Totally. I would love to see that article if you have it handy. As I think more and more about smell. Yeah. I love it. There's actually I'll add one more thing building on yours, UD, so you don't feel like you killed the conversation, which I don't think you did. There is a midrash about Yitzchak when he smells Yaakov's clothes, right? Yaakov has gone in dressed in like sheepskins or goat skins to try to fool Yitzchak that he's Esav. It says that Yitzchak liked the smell. And Rashi says something like, ew, goat skins. There's no way that smells good. Like, what does that mean? And the conclusion is that somehow that smells like Gan Eden. And this idea, oh, great, thank you. This idea that that Gan Eden has a smell that Yitzchak somehow knew, right? That like somehow, right? We don't know where Gan Eden's entrance is. We say it's like guarded by an angel with a fiery sword. But this idea that like if you smell a good smell, you're walking down the street and you smell a good smell, like that might be the entrance to Gan Eden, I think is like such a wild spiritual idea. And it reminded me of a time when I was in college. So it must have been like in the early 2000s where all of a sudden all of Manhattan smelled like pancake syrup, like maple syrup. If you sort of Google like Manhattan maple syrup, you'll see there's a whole New Yorker article about it. Basically, some factory in like, upwinds or downwinds, I guess, of Manhattan had some kind of massive spill. And so that smell came wafting over New York. And we know that that's the scientific reason, right? Like you said, UT, right? But for like a few hours, people just felt like there was this sort of magical pancake smell entering the world. And like they didn't know why it was and they didn't know where it came from. And it felt very spiritual and mystical, I think. One of my best friends went to school in Manhattan, so I knew about it like sort of right away. She was like, oh, this weird thing is happening. And I think that that's like that's the thing. We can choose to look at it in either direction. It could be spiritual, it could be funny, it could be whatever. But now whenever Rena smells maple syrup, I bet that she like thinks back to that time in Manhattan where it smelled like maple syrup for a few days.
You know where it came from.
Right. Even though we know where it came from in the end.
Yeah. Just got done making
We just made
maple
maple syrup.
You just made it?
Yes.
Yeah, outside of Manhattan. Yeah.
Yes.
It's
Oh.
obviously where it came from.
You know that right now you can make maple syrup in the Washtenaw County parks.
Well,
Takes hours to
No,
make it.
That's right. You can tap the trees. I'm sure that they accelerate many of the steps for you. But it's kind of cool to watch, I bet.
Yeah.
Anyway, smells are wonderful, and I hope everyone has a good smelling week. And I will see you next Wednesday at evening. So there'll still be Parsha class in the daytime, but there'll also be a pre-Pesach shir on the Afikomen. And that will be at 8 o'clock and location TBD. So if you have a strong preference between Zoom in someone's house or in like some other third location, feel free to let me know. But it will hopefully elevate our seders a little bit, especially at the end where we're slacking as it gets late. All right. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.